The sharp sound of metal hitting the floor echoed through the first-class cabin of Flight 447 as Rashid al-Najjar's laptop crashed to the ground, followed immediately by his body convulsing in the leather seat as his heart seized with crushing pain that felt like a vice tightening around his chest. "Help me! Please help me!" he gasped, his face turning gray as passengers around him froze in shock, unsure how to respond to the medical emergency unfolding before their eyes. But from row 32 in economy class, 10-year-old Jamal Washington was already moving, his small frame pushing through the narrow aisle with the urgent purpose of someone who had seen this exact situation before and knew exactly what needed to be done to save a stranger's life. The heart attack had struck without warning, as Rashid sat hunched over financial documents that told the story of his complete ruin, the stress of losing his $50 million real estate empire, finally overwhelming a cardiovascular system that had been weakened by months of sleepless nights and overwhelming anxiety. At 42, he had believed his wealth made him invincible, but the regulatory investigation that had frozen his assets and left him facing bankruptcy and criminal charges had pushed his body beyond its limits, and now he was fighting for his life 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, with 8 hours remaining until the flight reached Dubai. The collapse of Rashid's business empire had begun 6 months earlier, when federal investigators discovered that his business partner had been using their luxury development projects to launder money for international criminal organizations. While Rashid had been completely unaware of the illegal activities, his signature appeared on documents that made him appear complicit in schemes that could result in decades in federal prison. The investigation had frozen every asset he owned, destroyed his reputation in the business community, and left him facing the impossible task of explaining to his wife and 3 children that their life of luxury was over, and their father might be going to prison for crimes he didn't commit. The shame and terror of his situation had been consuming him for weeks, but sitting on this flight with nowhere to run and no distractions from the magnitude of his losses, the psychological pressure had finally triggered the physical crisis that was now threatening to end his life, before he could even attempt to rebuild or seek redemption for the mistakes that had led to his downfall. Jamal had been watching the well-dressed Arab man throughout the flight, noticing the signs of distress that his grandmother had taught him to recognize in adults who were struggling with problems beyond their ability to handle. The child's own journey on this aircraft was taking him toward an uncertain future with relatives he had never met in a foreign country, but his grandmother's lessons about helping people in crisis had become such an integral part of his character that his own fears and anxieties disappeared the moment he saw someone else in desperate need. The boy's presence on Flight 447 was the result of a series of tragedies and systemic failures that had left him without stable housing or family support, despite his obvious intelligence and resilience. His grandmother, Esther Washington, had raised him from infancy after his mother abandoned him to pursue a drug addiction that ultimately claimed her life. Esther had worked double shifts as a hospital cleaning lady to provide for Jamal while teaching him the values of compassion, service, and education that she hoped would give him opportunities she had never been able to access. When cancer took Esther 6 months earlier, Jamal had been placed in a group home where overcrowded conditions and overworked staff created an environment where older children preyed on younger ones, and basic needs like adequate food and medical care were often unmet. After weeks of systematic bullying and theft of his few possessions, Jamal had made the dangerous decision to live on the streets rather than endure continued abuse in a system that was supposed to protect him. Social services had finally located his great-aunt Fatima in Dubai, a woman who had immigrated decades earlier and built a successful business but had lost contact with her American relatives. When she learned about Jamal's situation, she had immediately arranged for his travel and legal guardianship, but the boy was traveling toward a completely unknown future, with someone he had never met in a culture he knew nothing about. "Sir, I'm here to help you," Jamal said calmly, as he reached Rashid's seat, his young voice cutting through the panic and confusion that had paralyzed the adult passengers who were witnessing the medical emergency. "My grandma had heart attacks, and I know what to do. Can you hear me?" The first-class flight attendant had been frantically searching for the medical kit, while other passengers called for a doctor over the intercom system. But Jamal was already taking action with the kind of practiced competence that comes from having lived through similar crises with the woman who had raised him during his early childhood. During Esther's final year, her heart condition had worsened dramatically, requiring Jamal to learn how to monitor her symptoms, administer medications, and respond to cardiac emergencies that could occur at any time of day or night. The 10-year-old had become expert at reading the signs of an impending heart attack, knowing which medications to give and in what dosages, and maintaining calm during medical crises that would have overwhelmed most adults. "Take slow, deep breaths," Jamal instructed, gently placing his small hand on Rashid's shoulder as the man struggled against the crushing pain in his chest. "I know it hurts really bad, but panicking makes it worse. My grandma taught me that staying calm helps your heart not work so hard." The child's confident demeanor and obvious knowledge about cardiac emergencies had an immediately calming effect, not just on Rashid, but on the surrounding passengers who had been frozen by uncertainty about how to respond to such a frightening situation. Here was a 10-year-old boy taking charge with the kind of medical understanding that most adults lacked, speaking with authority that came from real experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "Is there aspirin in the first aid kit?" Jamal asked the flight attendant who had returned with medical supplies, his tone suggesting that he knew exactly what medications might help during a heart attack. "And can you get some water? He needs to chew an aspirin if he can, and we need to keep him hydrated." The specific medical requests, delivered by someone so young, surprised the airline staff, but they quickly complied with his instructions while continuing their efforts to locate any medical professionals among the passengers who might be able to provide additional assistance. "What's your name, sir?" Jamal asked softly, maintaining eye contact with Rashid as a way of keeping him focused and conscious during the cardiac episode. "I'm Jamal, and I'm going to stay right here with you until you feel better. My grandma always said that nobody should have to be scared alone." "Rashid," the man managed to whisper between labored breaths, his hand reaching out instinctively to grasp the child's smaller fingers, as if physical connection to this calm, competent boy might anchor him to life during the most frightening moments he had ever experienced. "That's a really nice name, Mr. Rashid," Jamal replied, his voice carrying the kind of warmth and reassurance that seemed impossible, coming from someone who had every reason to be focused on his own problems rather than comforting a stranger in crisis. "Are you feeling any tingling in your arms or jaw? That's something we need to watch for." The medical assessment questions demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond what any 10-year-old should possess. But Jamal's experience as primary caregiver for his grandmother during her final illness had taught him to recognize symptoms and respond to emergencies that would overwhelm most adults. Other passengers in first class had begun to gather around Rashid's seat, some offering suggestions about what should be done, while others simply stood by, feeling helpless in the face of a medical emergency that none of them were equipped to handle. But Jamal's presence seemed to organize the chaos, providing clear direction and calm leadership that allowed everyone else to contribute in meaningful ways rather than simply adding to the confusion. "Can someone help me loosen his tie and collar?" Jamal asked, demonstrating the kind of practical thinking that comes from real experience with medical emergencies. "He needs to be able to breathe as easily as possible, and tight clothing can make that harder." A businessman sitting across the aisle immediately complied with the request, carefully loosening Rashid's expensive silk tie and unbuttoning the top of his shirt to reduce any restriction around his neck and chest. The collaborative response to Jamal's guidance created a sense of shared purpose among the passengers who had initially felt paralyzed by their inability to help. "The pain is getting a little better," Rashid said quietly, his color beginning to improve as the immediate crisis passed, and his heart rhythm returned to something closer to normal under Jamal's steady guidance and the effects of the aspirin he had chewed. "How do you know so much about heart attacks? You're just a child." The question opened a door to memories that were both painful and precious for Jamal, because explaining his medical knowledge meant sharing the story of his grandmother's illness and death, experiences that had shaped him into someone who could remain calm and helpful during exactly this type of emergency. "My grandma had a bad heart, and she taught me what to do when she got sick so I could help take care of her," Jamal explained, his voice becoming softer as he shared experiences that he rarely discussed with anyone. "She said that knowing how to help people when they're scared or hurting was one of the most important things anyone could learn." The revelation that this child had been a caregiver for a seriously ill adult provided context for his remarkable competence during the medical emergency, but it also revealed a level of responsibility and hardship that no 10-year-old should have to endure. Several passengers exchanged glances that conveyed their recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just in terms of the boy's medical knowledge, but in terms of his character and maturity. "She must have been very proud of you," Rashid said, his voice gaining strength as he began to recover from the worst of the cardiac episode. "You probably saved my life just now. I don't know how to thank someone for something like that." The gratitude in Rashid's voice was genuine and profound, because he understood that without Jamal's intervention, the panic and confusion surrounding his heart attack might have prevented him from receiving the immediate care that had stabilized his condition until professional medical help could be arranged. A doctor who had been sleeping in business class finally arrived at Rashid's seat, having been awakened by the commotion and the intercom announcements requesting medical assistance. Dr. Sarah Kim was a cardiologist returning from a medical conference in Los Angeles, and she had expected to find a chaotic scene with an untrained crew struggling to manage a cardiac emergency. Instead, she found a stable patient whose vital signs suggested that excellent initial care had already been provided. "Whoever handled the initial response did an excellent job," Dr. Kim said, after examining Rashid and reviewing what had already been done. "The patient's heart rhythm has stabilized. His color is good, and his breathing is much improved. The immediate danger appears to have passed." The professional validation of Jamal's emergency response created a moment of recognition throughout the first-class cabin. As passengers realized that the child who had taken charge during the medical crisis possessed skills and knowledge that had proven more effective than their own adult responses to the emergency. "It was him," Rashid said, gesturing toward Jamal with obvious admiration and gratitude. "This boy knew exactly what to do, and he stayed calm when everyone else was panicking. I don't think I would have made it without his help." Dr. Kim looked at Jamal with the kind of professional assessment that medical experts use when evaluating colleagues, and what she saw impressed her tremendously. "Young man, your response to this cardiac emergency was textbook perfect," she said. "Have you had formal medical training?" "No, ma'am," Jamal replied with the kind of modest honesty that had characterized all his responses during the crisis. "I just learned from taking care of my grandma when she was sick. She taught me that helping people who are hurting is one of the most important things you can do." The acknowledgement of Jamal's role in saving Rashid's life created a bond between them that transcended the enormous differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. And as the immediate medical crisis passed, Dr. Kim suggested that they continue monitoring Rashid's condition while allowing him to rest and recover his strength. "I'd like the young man to stay nearby," Dr. Kim added. "His presence seems to have a calming effect on the patient, and he's demonstrated excellent judgment about cardiac care. Sometimes, the best medicine is simply having someone who cares sitting with you." The medical recommendation that Jamal remain close to Rashid provided an opportunity for them to talk more extensively about the journeys that had brought them both onto this flight. And as the hours passed, their conversation revealed remarkable parallels in their experiences with loss, displacement, and the search for meaning in the face of overwhelming challenges. Jamal shared his story of traveling alone to Dubai to live with relatives he had never met, explaining how his grandmother's death had left him in the foster care system, where he had experienced neglect and abuse that made sleeping on the streets seem safer than remaining in the group home where he had been placed. His matter-of-fact recounting of homelessness, hunger, and systematic mistreatment by adults who were supposed to protect him revealed a level of resilience that amazed the listening passengers. Rashid, still weak from his heart attack but deeply moved by the child's resilience and maturity, began to share his own story of loss and despair, describing how the collapse of his business empire had left him facing bankruptcy, criminal charges, and the destruction of everything he had spent decades building. The investigation into his business partner's money laundering activities had revealed a web of corruption that threatened to destroy not just his financial assets, but his family's reputation and his own freedom. "I built my whole identity around being successful and wealthy," Rashid admitted, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose entire sense of self-worth had been based on external achievements rather than internal qualities. "When I lost everything, I felt like I had become nobody. Like my life didn't have any meaning if I couldn't provide luxury and security for my family. The admission of identity confusion struck Jamal as familiar, because he had struggled with similar questions about his own worth and place in the world after his grandmother's death had left him completely alone and dependent on systems that seemed designed to ignore or exploit vulnerable children. My grandma used to tell me that who you are isn't about what you have or how much money you make, Jamal said with the matter-of-fact tone that children use to share truths that adults often forget. She said that who you are is about how you treat people, and whether you try to help when you see someone who needs help, and whether you keep trying to do the right thing, even when it's really hard. The definition of identity based on character rather than achievement was revolutionary for someone like Rashid, whose self-worth had been measured entirely through financial success and social status. But coming from a child who possessed nothing yet radiated dignity and compassion, it carried a credibility that no adult advisor could have provided. I was actually thinking about ending my life when the heart attack started, Rashid admitted, his voice carrying the raw honesty of someone who had just faced his own mortality and found new perspective on his problems. The shame of losing everything and disappointing my family felt unbearable, but talking with you and experiencing your kindness has reminded me that there are more important things than money and status. The admission of suicidal thoughts was delivered with the kind of vulnerability that adults rarely share with children, but Jamal had proven himself capable of handling far more responsibility than his age would suggest, and his response demonstrated wisdom that went far beyond his years. My grandma used to say that the worst things that happen to you can teach you the most important lessons, Jamal said quietly, unconsciously providing exactly the perspective that Rashid needed to hear at his moment of greatest despair. She said that people who have been through really hard times are usually the strongest and kindest because they understand what it feels like to need help. The philosophy about hardship creating strength and compassion resonated deeply with Rashid's current situation, because his financial collapse did represent the end of everything he had built, but perhaps it also represented an opportunity to discover what truly mattered in life, beyond the accumulation of wealth and status. She also told me that every person has something special to give to the world, and that sometimes it takes losing everything else to discover what that special thing really is. Jamal continued, sharing wisdom that his grandmother had used to comfort him during the darkest periods of their life together. Maybe what happened to your business wasn't just bad luck. Maybe it was supposed to help you find out what you're really meant to do. The suggestion that his financial collapse might be purposeful rather than simply tragic offered Rashid a framework for understanding his crisis that transformed it from meaningless suffering into potential catalyst for growth and discovery. For the first time since receiving the devastating news about his business partner's criminal activities, he began to consider the possibility that his future might hold opportunities that were different from, but potentially more meaningful than his past success. Dr. Kim had been monitoring their conversation while periodically checking Rashid's vital signs, and she found herself impressed not just by Jamal's medical competence, but by his emotional wisdom and the therapeutic effect his presence was having on her patient. The boy's ability to provide both practical assistance and spiritual comfort represented exactly the kind of holistic approach to healing that medical schools tried to teach but which few practitioners mastered. Your grandmother taught you incredible wisdom, Rashid said, feeling a profound sense of gratitude not just for the medical assistance Jamal had provided, but for the emotional and spiritual guidance that was helping him see his crisis from a completely different perspective. I feel like meeting you might have saved my life in more ways than just the medical emergency. The recognition that their encounter was meaningful beyond the immediate cardiac crisis created a foundation for a relationship that both of them sensed could become important in their future lives, despite the enormous differences in their ages, backgrounds, and circumstances. As the flight continued through the night, their conversation deepened into discussions about family, loss, purpose, and the ways that unexpected connections between strangers could provide healing and hope during the darkest moments of life. Jamal's natural empathy and hard-earned wisdom about surviving difficult circumstances provided Rashid with insights that no expensive therapist or business advisor had been able to offer, while Rashid's gratitude and genuine interest in the boy's well-being provided Jamal with the kind of adult attention and respect that he had been missing since his grandmother's death. Other passengers had gradually returned to their seats as the medical emergency resolved, but many continued to glance over at the unlikely pair, whose conversation was clearly providing mutual comfort and support during what had been a traumatic experience for everyone involved. The sight of a wealthy businessman and a homeless child finding common ground in their shared experiences of loss and uncertainty challenged assumptions about what kinds of people could connect meaningfully with each other. "I want to make sure you're safe and well cared for when we land in Dubai," Rashid said, as dawn began to break outside the aircraft windows, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found new purpose through helping others rather than just accumulating wealth for himself. "And I want to ask your permission to stay in touch with you as I work to rebuild my life using the lessons your grandmother taught you." The offer of assistance was motivated not by pity, but by genuine recognition that Jamal had already proven himself to be exactly the kind of person whose guidance could help Rashid avoid repeating the mistakes that had led to his downfall, and whose presence in his life could provide ongoing reminders about what truly mattered beyond financial success. "I'd like that," Jamal replied, with a smile that managed to be both young and wise at the same time. "My grandma always said that the best families are the ones you choose, not just the ones you're born into. Maybe we can be family for each other." The concept of chosen family provided both of them with a framework for understanding their unlikely connection, and as Flight 447 began its descent toward Dubai, both passengers had been transformed by their encounter during the medical emergency that had brought them together in such dramatic circumstances. Rashid's heart attack had been stabilized by Jamal's quick thinking and medical knowledge, but more importantly, his spiritual and emotional crisis had been addressed by the child's wisdom about finding meaning through service to others rather than accumulation of wealth. The boy's grandmother's teachings had provided a roadmap for rebuilding his life based on different values and priorities than those that had driven his previous success. For Jamal, the experience of saving an adult's life and providing emotional support during a crisis had reinforced his sense of his own capabilities and worth, while Rashid's gratitude and offer of ongoing support provided the kind of stable relationship that he had been seeking since his grandmother's death, left him completely alone in the world. As the plane touched down in Dubai, the wealthy businessman whose life had been saved by a 10-year-old boy was already planning ways to use his remaining resources and connections to ensure that Jamal would have opportunities for education and growth that matched his remarkable intelligence and character, while also learning from the child's wisdom about what constituted true success and meaningful existence. The heart attack that could have ended Rashid's life had instead become the catalyst for a transformation that would benefit not just his own family, but the brilliant child whose courage and compassion had reminded him that true wealth was measured by the positive impact you had on other people's lives, rather than the numbers in your bank accounts. The unlikely friendship that began with a medical emergency 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean would grow over the years as both learned that sometimes the most important relationships in life come from the most unexpected circumstances, and that wisdom and healing can flow in both directions when hearts are open to receiving the gifts that others have to offer. The whispered words that Jamal had spoken during Rashid's darkest moment, reminding him that every person had something special to give to the world, and that losing everything might be the key to discovering what really mattered, had planted seeds of hope that would grow into a completely different understanding of success, purpose, and the meaning of a life well lived.